Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. My name is Simon, and I will be your host for today's YPIC webinar. Before we move over to the actual webinar, please let me briefly introduce you to Alexandra Freeman. Before Alexandra started as an executive director at the Winton Center for Risk and Evidence Communication at the University of Cambridge, she already had a very successful career actually at the BBC as a producer of documentaries or series, for which she actually received several awards for science journalism. Her efforts back then had basically one goal, and it was to bring science to the broadest possible audience. Of course, she still wants to do this now, but nowadays she is basically focusing on scientific communication and tries to reform the scientific publication system, mostly through the Octopus Platform. So today, Alexandra will introduce us to this Octopus platform, and the presentation will take about 30 minutes. So there is plenty of time for questions and discussions afterwards. If you have questions, you can just directly pop a question to our questions person who is there through the chat. And afterwards, there will also be a more live discussion with a Miro board on which Alexandra will inform you better. That being said, I will now give the floor to Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's lovely to be with you all this morning. I'm going to do that bit where I try and share my screen, which will hopefully work. So yes, as Simon said, I'm going to give a quick introduction to the Octopus system. And I came up with the idea of Octopus after moving from the media back into academia and having a team of postdocs who were talking about the publication system in a way that seemed really quite familiar to me coming from journalism, because the way that they were being judged in their careers was essentially on the production of papers rather than on the underlying scientific work. It was all about how many people read their papers. They were talking about what story to tell in their papers through their research. And all of this just struck me that, hang on a minute, we seem to be turning the scientific publishing system into journalism. So I thought, we need a better system than this. It's driving science in the wrong direction. So this is where the Octopus idea came from. So what's wrong with the current publishing system? I've already given you a few ideas of what I think is wrong, and I'm sure you've got your own ideas about what's wrong with the current system. But the things that I think Octopus will probably most address are things like it takes way too long to publish anything. I mean, if we were now only publishing things about COVID in the traditional way that everything else got published, we'd probably only just be getting to hear about it. We all know that it can take months, and even years to get things published. There are no good guides to quality. And again, this has been brought out, I think, during the COVID crisis, where the concerns of the quality of work published in all journals, all levels of perceived quality of journal. Peer review just isn't a good enough guide. That sort of level or impact factor of the journal isn't a good enough guide. We're using really proxy measures for trying to understand what good science looks like. And of course, there are all the issues beyond those first two. What gets published in the first place? Publication bias. How detailed the methods are that are published. You know, the word limits and readability concerns from journals telling you to make it clear, make it short, just get to the story. None of that helps reproducibility if you want to read a paper with the aim of doing exactly the same thing again, or understanding what that person did in enough detail. And then, of course, there's all the questionable research practices, and I love that term, that help get your work published, helping results fit a hypothesis. And this is a bigger problem in some areas than others. A lot of my postdocs are psychologists, and psychology has seen a real problem with the reproducibility crisis and some of these questionable research practices. Cherry picking, failing to report things that you did, but which didn't reach statistical significance. P-hacking, checking the statistical significance and then either stopping data collection early or collecting more to get to that mythical, magical P equals 0.05. Excluding data points, rounding results, and harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. That's another sadly common thing. That you make up the hypothesis to fit the data, to make it look like the data fitted the hypothesis. So these are all huge problems that have caused issues in the publication record. And then, of course, once something's published, there's all the problems of finding and accessing relevant work. I mean, part of this is driven by the publish or perish culture, which means that everybody's pushing out as many publications as they can, which means that when you try and actually find something, it's becoming increasingly difficult. And then all of these problems, I think, have a real knock-on effect on the research culture. I mean, that's how I first noticed it, was the culture that the postdocs were being subjected to. There's a hierarchical structure based on inequalities of access to the one single measure of success, these high impact publications. So more junior researchers can be bullied, including pushed into questionable research practices. People lose the sense of fulfillment and control in the face of this system. And I'm sure we've all heard about these kind of hierarchical abuses of editors of journals and peer reviewers not necessarily behaving in a truly ethical fashion. And I think a lot of these problems stem from just one principal issue, and that's that journals are being pulled in two different directions. So, first of all, and a really important role, is the dissemination of results. And it's the one that drives the revenues of journals, really. If you think of the most popular bits of journals, it's the news and views sections. It's nice and easy to read. It gives you a quick summary of the findings that you want to know about. And the aim for things to be attractive and readable, as I said, drives things like word counts and publication bias and a lot of the questionable research practices. But then on the other hand, at the same time, journals are being almost forced to fulfill another job, and a rather thankless one, which is being a kind of patent office for establishing priority and a place to record the full details of methods and data. And that's a very specialised thing, really. It's a different kind of communication. And I think it's quite natural, if you think about it as a sort of selection environment, that this second job is being sacrificed to bend the incentive structures towards serving the first job, which is gives a wider audience. And so I think this, because the primary research record is the main record of what researchers get judged on, the bending of the incentive structure towards dissemination and simple linear narratives is actually creating the poor incentive structure for the whole assessment structure of researchers, because you're now being judged on how well you do that first thing and not so much on how well you do the second. And in fact, hopefully that's a reflection of all the underlying actual work. So what can we do? I think we have to split these two jobs. And that's what Octopus is. It's designed to be the new primary research record. And that's to take on that second job, leaving journals free to do that first one properly. And then we don't have the incentive structures of good dissemination affecting the incentives of good research. So if we can start again and design a new primary research record that is actually designed from first principles to serve science well and to do the job of disseminating or sharing the very detailed research work that actually gets done, then I think we can design it to suit the 21st century and not the 19th century or earlier technology that journals grew in. So it can be digital first. We can almost at a glance, at a stroke, solve the problems of open access by making it free to read and free to write, by keeping the costs down. You can build in automatic language translation so that things like not having English as your first language, whilst it's the first language of scientific journals, most of them, being a massive barrier to entry. All of those should be relatively simple to implement. But then I think you can think more deeply about the structure and not base it around the unit of publication being a paper. You can make it smaller publication units. And I think that's a key concept, and I'll explain why. The scientific process, as I see it, naturally comes in a series of steps, one after the other. And each step requires quite different skills and different amounts of resources. And I think this is true in all fields of science, but I'm actually very open to people telling me that in their field, this isn't the kind of structure. And of course, it might be slightly modified from this, but this kind of structure of scientific inquiry. And if you have the unit of dissemination being a paper, it forces people to get right to the end of this process before sharing any of it. And I think that causes a lot of problems. First of all, you're retrospectively forcing a linear narrative onto something that's not a linear process. Nobody goes through each of these steps in turn without having multiple data sets or different kinds of analysis that they've tried or methods that didn't work and that they've piloted and then changed. All of this is actually a much messier process. It's not linear. And also only being able to publish when data supports the hypothesis. We all know that it's quite difficult to get neutral or negative results published because they're not kind of exciting for the dissemination part of the journals. But it's really important for everybody else to know it. And it also means that we tend to hoard our work and be secretive and non-collaborative because we don't get credit till we get to the end and we're worried about people scooping us along the way. But in a primary research record that we can design from scratch, we could allow a structure of publication that more closely matches the actual process, with each publication type linked to the one before it in the chain. And if you're familiar with registered reports, which is a kind of publication where you submit to the journal at the point of completing the methods or protocol, and then it gets peer reviewed and then accepted or not for publication, then you publish the whole thing once you've collected the data, where it's peer reviewed again, but the journal's already accepted it. It's a bit like taking that concept of breaking the link between what you're setting out to do and what you find to the ultimate conclusion, which is breaking it up into much smaller units and publishing each one, getting peer review each on each one as you go. And that's the 8th type of publication in Octopus, which is a review. And they can be published attached to any other kind of publication, and they're treated and valued in the same way as any other type of publication. And I think that's crucial because reviewing is a scientific skill just like any other. And by incentivizing it like that, we can not only encourage reviewing, but encourage good reviewing. Because also in Octopus, we have a rating system. So I'm going to show you how this works. This is what Octopus looks like at the moment. We've got this prototype up live. And across the top, you can see the branching structure of linked publications. Every publication has to be linked to an existing one. So it means we've not just got this soup of stuff that helps with navigation and discovery, as does this rating system. And that allows well-rated publications to come to the top of searches. And in fact, funders could look for well-rated and well-reviewed publications and offer to fund the next step in the scientific chain. They could even offer funding to several groups simultaneously. And then we've got this red flagging system for really problematic things, where if you spot plagiarism or potential unethical behaviour, then you can red flag a publication, and unlike retraction, we'd all be able to see what your concerns were immediately, and authors would be able to respond to that. So any logged in user can rate publications on 3 predefined, preset criteria, which are different for each publication type. And that allows us as a scientific community to decide what good science is for each type of publication. And I think that's critical. That allows us to get away from the most proxy metrics that we use at the moment and try and define metrics of quality that are a bit closer to what we would want them to represent. And it's easy to write a linked publication, and that helps you, whether it's a review or a next one in the chain. So that helps build this chain structure, which I hope would allow people quite quickly and easily to find other publications related to their problem or research question of interest. So I think there's a load of benefits that this structure would bring. Firstly, this instant publication. I mean, not only is it faster, but you can get your priority, so you're not worried about other people scooping you. You get smaller author groups, which means that it's more meritocratic. If you've done the work, if you're the statistician doing the analysis, or you're the technician developing a protocol, you get the credit for that piece of work. You're not within a whole large number of authors and nobody being quite sure who did what. And that actually also comes down to accountability as well. So if somebody's doing poor practice, maybe the data's not well collected or worse, then your reputation isn't affected by that because the bit that you did is more clearly delineated. And then this removal of the need for narrative, removing that pressure for the questionable research practices that I mentioned, and also allowing you to publish things that you wouldn't normally be able to publish in the current system, which are really important. So lots of small data sets, for instance, can add up to a useful body of knowledge. But at the moment, it's quite difficult to publish small data sets. In Octopus, you can. In Octopus, you can share just a hypothesis. You may not have the resources and funding yet to investigate it, but if you've got a really good idea, you can get the credit for publishing that, and maybe funders will then spot that and offer you funding to take it further. And the rating system, which I know can worry some people, the idea of turning scientific quality into simple ratings like Amazon or eBay, well, actually, we use metrics every day anyway. It's much more important to try and get those metrics closer to what we want them to represent. So it allows us to, as a community, to define what we think these metrics should represent. And it also helps us finding good quality stuff, because another worry is that you end up with a bigger and bigger pool of poor quality publications. But of course, peer review is much more important than a simple rating. And as I said, we're trying to incentivize peer review by treating it as a publication in its own right. And I think this kind of open peer review as well is really important, because being able to read other people's critiques of a publication can be really helpful in giving you insight into the potential limitations and the potential upsides of any publication. So this is, as you can see, how you move through Octopus at the moment to publish on it, and we're trying to design it to be as simple and easy to use as possible. And this post-publication peer review, I think, has a lot of benefits. It allows fast, unbiased publication of any publication, but it also helps with really encouraging this collaborative working and really kind of highlighting the fact that being able to critique the work of others well and carefully is a scientific skill in its own right. And as I said, they are at equal status to all the others. And that's important, because then that can appear on your CV, your individual personal page. And that's crucial to Octopus. Within Octopus, every user has a profile. and it means that it can produce much more useful metrics via this profile, and that is useful for institutions and funders. You can instantly see what type of researcher each person is. I mean, you can see me there, obviously. I've very well-rounded researcher. I've published every kind of publication on Octopus. Obviously, it's only a test site, but if you were looking to hire somebody who was a real data collection person, or a real hypothesis generator, or somebody who's a real analyst, all of these skills, you'd be able to see what kind of skill set this person had. And you'd be able to see what sort of what their peers thought of them in terms of the ratings. So as I say, Octopus wouldn't be a good read. This isn't a nice, easy narrative like you normally read in the news and views sections of journals, say. But that's where I think journals can take off and take over in that process. They can take the best content from Octopus and editorialize it for their specific readership. In Octopus, it may not be an easy read, but it should be a much more useful read for those who really want to know what work is being done. So finally then, what's in it for everybody in the system at the moment? So for researchers, I hope it makes publication easier. It removes barriers to access. It makes it easier to find work. It makes it easier to publish work, and work of all kinds. It does require a bit of a different way of thinking. People often initially think, oh, you're simply cutting up the idea of a paper. But it's more than that, because it changes the way you think about the work you set out to do when you realize that your outputs are not going to be a linear narrative. Institutions, I hope that it will be able to give much better information about people that they currently employ and people that they might want to employ. And so it'll be a better way to help with promotion and selection. For funders, as I mentioned already, they can search for well-rated publications and offer funding. It gets rid of all that terribly wasteful grant application process, or not all of it, but a lot of it. And they can assess individual researchers the way that institutions can. And I really hope that it can drive a different way of thinking about funding. Maybe funding can come in smaller units. Maybe funding can be applied in different ways. As I said, you could offer funding for a well-rated protocol to 3 or 4 different laboratories to carry out the same protocol, perhaps, increasing reproducibility. For journals, well, I have to admit, when I first set out the idea of Octopus, I thought, well, maybe it's a replacement for journals. But I hope now that I've come to a different way of thinking about it, as I've said, I hope that they can become more focused on the editorialized, synthesizing, and disseminating to specific audiences, which is probably what journals were originally invented for. So I hope there's benefits for everybody in Octopus. And it's almost it is a virtuous circle. Once the funders and the institutions are using it, that will drive researchers to use it. Once researchers are using it, that will drive funders and institutions to use it. I hope that you think that it's a good idea. I'm very interested in your questions. I want to thank the supporters that have allowed Octopus to get this far, which is at a prototype stage. And we're now, with the support from the UKRI, the UK's government funder for science, and in partnership with JISC, my colleagues from JISC are at the seminar today, we're taking it to launch next spring. So we're in the phase now where we're doing a lot of user testing. Be very keen to hear your feedback, and yeah, getting it ready for launch. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I think this is an absolutely awesome idea that you have there, and it looks fantastic. As Simon said before, we will move in a few minutes to an interactive, what's it called, a Miro board.
Yes.
You all can post questions, and we all together interact with Alexandra on some of the questions you have. Still, we had some that were directly addressed to me. And I'd like with one from Martin Danens. So he asked me if he could actually ask the question himself. So please, Martin, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Florian. Alex, me too. I am blown away. I nearly got emotional. It's yes, you address everything in one go. What I see happening is that you're giving science to humanity instead of single humans, and that's where it's supposed to be. So you couldn't find a bigger fan than myself. I knew conceptually what it was about. Now I've seen a bit more and only getting more enthusiastic. I have obviously discussed this with the PhD students in the lab. And I feel like apart from all the journal stuff, which you now also elegantly seem to be able to address, from young scientists' perspective, I feel that they're afraid about the transition. At what point will the funding agencies and so on and so on be ready for this? So if they're thinking about the future, what could you tell them to take part in the system in order for it to take off, but without compromising or taking any risks for their future?
Yeah, I mean, the technology of Octopus is really easy. The problem is obviously the big political move, the big cultural move. I think initially Octopus will almost act a bit like preprint servers in that they can run alongside the current system for a little while. So publishing in Octopus, I hope people will want to get there, first of all, to get their priority, so that you feel like, okay, I've got my patent, I've got my stamp that this is my idea at this time. But it won't stop you writing a paper and publishing it wherever you would normally anyway. So I hope that it will run alongside journals to start with in order to soften that transition. But I also hope that the move can be quite quick. I mean, we've seen how fast things can change. And one of the massive advantages, I think, of UKRI funding this is not the funding, which is obviously great, but it's the political door opening that having a big government-based funder gives. So, my job now is to talk to all the different funders, all the different institutions, everybody who has a stake in this system. And I feel like it's a moment where everybody thinks the system has to change, but everybody's watching everybody else. And a lot of people saying, well, there's no better alternative. And to be able to say, well, there is a better alternative, help us co-design that better alternative to make sure it works with you, works for you, works with your workflows, then we can all take that jump together. That's what I hope.
If I can still use this window of opportunity, there was another just remark from one of the PhD students saying that, or wouldn't you be afraid that your hypothesis and problem section will fill up very fast, because this is the easy bit, right? So everybody wants to be the first to have the idea, and then you can say everything that came from it was actually thanks to me. So there's the biggest gain, the least investment in that section. How do you think that might evolve?
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought of people thinking that everything that then comes after that is thanks to them. But I do think there will be a bit of a gold rush.
Yes, that's what I think. Yeah.
Try and get their problems and hypotheses out there, because you essentially get a publication sort of for free, because there are going to be a lot of problems that people already know are problems. What we're doing before launch is searching the existing open access literature and extracting from it existing problems, so that Octopus is pre-populated with a structure of problems, so that the biggest and most common well-known problems might already be in there. So you might not get quite such a gold rush, but that does depend on how good our natural language processing is, how many we get out there. But because every publication has to be linked to an existing one, we have to give a sort of framework. It's a bit like seeding a coral reef. You've got to give a skeleton for things to start growing on. So that's what I'm spending quite a lot of time behind the scenes doing at the moment. But yeah, I do think there'll be a gold rush, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because it'll encourage people to use the platform. And I think once you get used to using the platform, then you'll carry on using the platform if it works well.
Thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so maybe I can add to this a bit more, because I think it's actually a valid point that maybe some of the easier parts of the research process might be blown up. But I also think it's a very fair way to show recognition or give recognition to actually has solved the problems in a way. I think we've all been confronted with at one point in our careers with fighting about authorship of publications because somebody really had a great idea, but then you put half a year of work in it and you still need to fight for your place on the paper. So I think that's actually a good system to show who has actually done what. I have one more questions. There was a bit, I think a bit hard to answer. So the one who asked me maybe allows me to rephrase it. What are one or two of the biggest criticisms about this system that you have so far encountered?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, I think the biggest challenges are quite obvious and people tend to come and hit me with them. So the two that are usual are people are worried about open peer review because they're worried that junior researchers won't feel able to write harsh critiques of the work of senior researchers, or anybody, in fact, that there'll be a kind of barrier there. And in fact, somebody did once suggest that if that were a problem, we could have a sort of 6-month golden period where when you publish a publication, initially for the first 6 months, it's anonymous. Your name only appears on it at the 6-month anniversary. And in that period, perhaps all reviews and ratings are kind of golden. And so it's a golden period of double-blind peer review. That might help people feel like that they're able to speak out. But I do hope that actually quite quickly, and it won't be immediate, but quite quickly, the culture will change because people will see what a good review looks like, and that simply being rude isn't a good review and gets rated poorly, and in fact could get red flagged. And so people will understand what good critique looks like and feel emboldened to do it. So that's one. The other, and I think it again will be a problem, is that Octopus will initially be flooded by poor quality publications because people will rush to get stuff published that maybe couldn't get published in journals because it wasn't very good quality, or they're just kind of experimenting with the platform and chucking rubbish into it. And again, that's going to rely on the red flagging and the rating system to help sort things out. And the fact that everything goes against your professional profile. So we're using ORCID as the login system so that everything you do will be linked to that profile. And you won't want rubbish and bad stuff to be linked to your professional profile that your potential employers and your peers can see. But I think it will take a bit of time for people to get used to that and for the culture to settle out. So I think there will be a rocky few months where it's working itself out. And I think to get enough momentum for Octopus to ride over those rocky few months is crucial. But I mean, I never thought that Wikipedia would work because I thought it would just fill up with rubbish and people fighting, and it works brilliantly. So I'm sure there's some very clever behind the scenes work on Wikipedia, which I need to know a lot about to see how they make it work. But yeah, I'm hoping Octopus can work too. I mean, it's so important, right, for the whole of science that something like this does work. I just really hope that enough people feel that way and will help make it work.
Okay, thanks. So I have another question from a quite investigative listener here. So the person has looked at the source code of your platform apparently and is asking if you're still actively developing the platform right now, because it seems like the source code is a bit outdated. Can you comment on that?
Yep. So the source code you're seeing is for the prototype that we got coded a couple of years ago now. The pandemic has made things a little bit slower. But as I said, my colleagues from JISC are on this call and they are working on the next, or they're about to start working on the next iteration of it. So what you're seeing is the prototype code, and in fact, we're going to go to a Miro board in a minute where you can see some of the new designs, and we're working on designs, not coding them up, just working on designs, you know, offline and in designer software, and so that people can try them out, and then we'll recode. So that's why it looks out of date at the moment. But good on you for checking out our GitHub.
Another listener asks, how do you think, and this is actually one of my questions I wanted to ask later, how do you think long-term funding could work out? Because if people really get invested in the platform, they should know that this investment will hold over the next few years.
Yeah, very good question. I should have brought that up as one of the biggest problems people raise, actually. So everybody asks this. The funding from UKRI will take us through the initial few years. And I mean, obviously that's important. And I hope that the UKRI brand gives people a feeling of trust in the platform. What I want in the future is it's absolutely against all of the ethics of Octopus to charge people to publish or to read. So that is absolutely, written into the contracts that would never happen. I hope to keep the costs of Octopus to such a low level that it wouldn't be a big job to fund it. So if we can keep it cheap, my measures of success are not like those of any other business where they want to grow. I want to shrink Octopus to be a really small core of people with a very big open community of people who, are able to contribute to it. But by keeping the costs very small, we keep the running costs very low, which means that I hope that there will be funders out there who are willing to fund it. And if it comes to me having to go cap in hand to institutions and say, give us £1,000 each, there are a lot of academic institutions where that's the cost of one journal, and if Octopus is as successful as I hope it will be, that should be nothing to keep Octopus running. But it is, it's something that we do have to work on. But I would never charge people to read or publish to it.
Okay, so maybe I can follow up with a question of mine here. I mean, the current publishing industry is making millions on our backs. Yep. Because we need to pay for reading the papers, we need to pay for publishing the papers. How do you actually think you can convince them that your system actually works, because you're basically also taking from their profits in a way?
Well, I guess there's two parts to that question. How can I convince them that it works? Well, I don't need to make a 40% profit, so that makes it cheap. But also, there's a lot of potential automation, really. And I know that that's a very scary word. I would be scared at the thought of automating a lot. But actually, as a community, if you think about it, what journals are doing is getting free people to write things for free and people to review things for free. And basically, they're doing the linkage and then they're publishing it. Well, the publication flow to making things appear online, we know that can be automated pretty easily. And we don't need to stand by everything has to be in font Arial size 11. All of that's nonsense. As a writer, you can make it look like you want it to look and lay it out the way you want it to lay out. So all of that waste can go. And then it's simply the matching of authors with reviewers. Well, that process is honestly breaking down anyway, because people don't have time to review other people's work because they're being pressurized to write their own work. And there's just, the whole system's grown and, mushroomed too much. So I think by just starting again, everybody's doing everything for free, but everybody's getting credit for what they're doing. We can cut those costs right down. How can I convince the journals that this is a good thing? Well, obviously, it's not for all journals. But those people who work in the publishing system, who actually care about science, have been saying, I can see that this is better for science, and I can see that this being the future of publishing. And then journals can adapt their workflow to really good dissemination, really good editorialization. I mean, that is a vital part. Octopus, as I said, it's not going to be easy or nice to read. So if you're an engineer or a doctor wanting to know the latest findings on particular aspects, then you don't want to have to trawl through Octopus to read all the detailed protocols or anything like that. Somebody editorializing it, writing nice reviews, writing a nice summary, the latest findings this week, I mean, I would pay to have the right summary of what's going on in my field sent to my inbox every week.
Okay. There was another question on how you actually plan to deal with conflicts of interest on your platform.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Conflicts of interest, I think, are not dealt with well in the current journal system. And what I'm hoping is that we're trying to use the birth of the new system to try to clear the decks of quite a lot of cues of unconscious bias. And actually, this is one of the questions that I'd like to ask you all when we go to the Miro board in a minute. And you'll be able to put your views on the board. It's like an interactive whiteboard. So we're trying to strip out cues like not allowing people to upload photos to their profiles, not using people's first names on author lists so that you can't tell people or guess people's genders. So all of these cues we're trying to strip out. Now I've forgotten what the question was. Sorry, I went off on a little sideline.
So the question was basically, how do you deal, or how do you intend to deal with potential conflicts of interest?
Oh, yes, that's right. Sorry, yes, that's how I was getting there. So conflicts of interest is one of the things that I want to be listed on everybody's individual author page, so that people can refer to it all the time, and so that you know what you've been paid to do, what potential conflicts of interest you've got, and it's always there. You're not reliant on an author declaring it for each publication. So that's how I'm hoping to deal with it, so that it's just a feature of yourself, your potential conflicts of interest, that people can always refer to.
So is this also something that other people can then criticize if you're not declaring your conflicts of interest correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe the last question before we go to the board. Someone has asked if it, sorry, let me read that again. Yeah, so how do you intend to deal with if PIs or first authors actually in the background tell other people to rate their work positively? So
yes. Yeah, that's another good question that often comes up. And I think the best answer is transparency. So because everything in Octopus will be open, you'll be allowed to see who's rated whom. So in fact, I'm hoping that the open source community will write nice little visualization plugin modules so that you can see mates rates kind of circles, and that would then potentially, we could make them appear on people's authors pages. So there's a nice simple visualization of who you've been rated by and who you've rated, who you've published with and who you've rated, so that there are metrics available to check that out. I think that's the only way to do it, really. Make it obvious.
Okay, thank you very much. So, and with that, Alexandra, I want to thank you very, very much. I think it was a brilliant talk. It's a brilliant idea. I think all of us can see how this might actually shape the future of science for the better, for the much better. I actually received in the background also a lot of positive feedback from the people in the audience. So also a big thank you from them. The board will be open over the weekend, so I will surely work on it further. And yeah, thank you for giving this talk. Thank you for this brilliant idea. And I will inform all of you, of course, when you can listen to it again online. Thank you, Alex.
My pleasure, and thank you.